I'm Toby Ord, and I'm here today from Oxford University, where I'm a research fellow in philosophy, and also I'm the president of an organization called Giving What We Can, and I'll be talking about these types of things. I should say as well that I haven't always been a philosopher. I used to be a computer scientist beforehand, but I decided I was interested in logic and things like this, which at my university, the philosophy department was mainly in charge of. I spent more and more time over there, and I was also very interested in a whole lot of ethical questions, and ended up being sucked away from computer science to the world of philosophy. But hopefully you'll see that I've got an approach to some of these philosophical or ethical questions, which is perhaps more quantitative than you're used to seeing from people who look at these things. So let's start. I have always been interested in charity and helping other people, and in particular, when I was an undergraduate, I used to get into conversations through the night with my friends, and they would say to me, in some heated political debate, say something like, well, if you think that, why don't you send all your money to help people starving in Africa, or some other cliche like this. But this was meant to be a reductio of my position, that you can't possibly think that because you'd have to spend a lot of your time and effort helping these other people. But I started to treat it more like, maybe I should be doing this. Maybe I should be thinking about what I'm doing with my income, and maybe actually that is the logical conclusion. If you think all people are equal and that you can help people in poor countries for less, maybe I should be doing something like that. Maybe I should investigate it. And I noticed a couple of philosophers have written on this. Peter Singer has some very good papers on this. And Famine, Affluence, and Morality, for anyone who wants to look that up. And there's some very strong arguments, and I took these seriously and started to think about what I could do in my life if I really wanted to help people who are less fortunate than myself. So when I was thinking about this, I divided the different ways I could think of helping up into these four categories. One was voluntary work, one was my career, so what good could come through my career. Another one was the personal relationships that I have. And another one was donations. And I thought that that's something that a lot of people neglect as a way that they can have a lot of impact in the world. It was also the thing that was most amenable to analysis. So I decided I wanted to work out, well, what in terms of donations could I do if I really wanted to? What could I achieve? And that's the topic of this talk, really. So I worked out that over my career, I'd be able to earn about £1.5 million. And I encourage all of you to try to work out what you'll earn over your career. I think this is an informative thing to do, particularly as you can work out then what you could achieve if you really wanted to. And it's nice to know that through donations. It might be that you can achieve even more through your career. I worked out that I only really needed about £500,000 over my life if I kind of kept on my current lifestyle, which is very good. I have at that point I was a graduate student, and I had pretty much all the things I really needed in my life. I have a lovely wife and great friends, and have wonderful conversations, and can see beautiful places and travel to Europe once or twice a year. On that, living in the UK is a nice advantage there. But it could take some a bit more expensive. I could take some travel and listen to some the best music ever recorded, and the things that I can do would rival a lot of the things that a king could do a century earlier. We've got it pretty good in the world today, and so I thought actually I have a lot of these things which are of a lot of value, and if I spent this extra £1 million on myself, it wouldn't actually make my life all that much better, because I get the things which are of highest value, or the best bang for your buck in your life, you get first, and then you get less and less effective things added on later. And so I thought, actually, I could probably do that if I really wanted to, and carry on living a slightly kind of grad student plus kind of lifestyle, and donate about £1 million. And so I thought, well, what could I do with that? And once you start to get a big number like this, it's worth putting in more effort. What can I do with £1 million? As opposed to, is this £10 I'm donating for this fun run? Is that effective? Or is this other thing effective? If it's on that kind of level, dollars perhaps I should use, I'll try. And a pound is $1.50. So tried to think about these things, and if it is just these very small sums, it's not really worth doing the analysis as to what's going on. But if you realize that over your life you can do a lot, at about £1 million. I mean, if you were spending £1 million on a house or something, you would put in some time doing some research on that, because you might be able to get, say, a house that's 10% better. It's a good deal. You spend £900,000 for a house that would be worth £1 million or something like that. So I want to think about that kind of thing when it comes to charity and trying to get a good deal. There's many ways that I could help people with my money. For example, education, empowerment of disempowered groups such as women in poor countries, or promoting peace. I mean, the list is very long. I'm going to focus on health in this talk because there's some really good evidence about health, and so you can get quantitative and get into the nitty-gritty. And I also think that it's plausible that health in poor countries is one of the best ways that we can help people with our money. And if you think that actually one of these other things is even better than health, that's great, because it means this is a lower bound for how much you can achieve in your life. So by looking at health, maybe we can do even better than that. So the first question here is what metric should you use to try to work out what you can achieve with a certain amount of money? So one common thing that's talked about is the percentage spent on overheads and administration. And so you often hear something where they say that only 10% of this organization's budget is spent on administration. I don't think that that's a very useful metric, because what a charity does is much more important than how much it spends on these. So there's a lot of variety between charities in terms of what they fund. And I think the key question instead is, for a given donation, how much benefit do people receive? So it could be, for example, that if an organization spends its money on program evaluation, which is checking to see after they try something. So suppose they build some wells and in Kenya, and if they spend some money to go back and find out whether those wells are being used and whether they're still working 10 years later, try to find out the lifespan of that well to work out how good a project it was, to compare it with other projects, that counts as overheads. But it's also the exact type of thing that organizations should be doing. So there's this issue that the overheads money is not wasted. And even if it were wasted, the difference of 10% or 20% or something like that between charities, you'll see later in this talk, is actually very small. The differences get much bigger than that. And so this would be a relatively bad way of assessing things. There's a lot of research that can help us answer this question of, for a given donation, how much benefit do people receive? But most people aren't aware of it. And the greatest difference here comes from the type of intervention performed. So for example, whether you distribute malaria nets to help prevent children getting malaria, or whether you distribute some medication to prevent, to limit the effect of HIV on your system, or whether you distribute condoms to try to avoid new people getting this, or whether you build wells, or whether you provide sanitation systems such as toilets and sewers. So there's a whole lot of these different things you could be doing with money, and some of them are much more effective than others, and as we'll see. Just as an example to get to motivate this, that's quite easy to understand. If you're providing someone with a guide dog to try to combat the bad effects of blindness, this costs about $40,000. In contrast, it costs about $20 to completely cure someone of blindness caused by trachoma. So, for example, if you wanted to donate $40,000 in order to fight blindness, you could either provide a single guide dog, or you could completely cure 2,000 people. So there's a very big difference there, because presumably also having a guide dog is less good than, while being blind, is less good than having your blindness cured as well. So it seems like in that case, there's something of a factor of 2,000 or so between these different types of interventions. And this type of thing does come up quite a lot. This is not just an aberrant case. But you might wonder, how can we take this idea further and look at cases where this is very much an apples to apples comparison, but in many cases you won't be able to do that. It will be, say, curing blindness versus saving someone from dying of AIDS. And they're quite different. It's hard to compare them. So we want some way to broaden the universe of interventions which can be compared with each other in order to work out what's most effective within that universe of possibilities. So how can we compare apples and oranges? So here are a couple of ways you might try to do that. So the first one is you might think of as, how many lives can we save? And that was one of the subtitle, I think, of this talk. And that's the type of question which is interesting, because I think most people don't ask that. They might hear something like, it only costs $1,000 to save a life with our charity. And they might respond to that by saying, well, okay, here's $1,000. But they don't tend to say, well, hang on a second, if you actually save someone's life literally for $1,000, maybe I should give you another 1,000 and another 1,000. I mean, if there was someone on the street who you met who was dying, and you would take this more seriously in a certain way. So what I'm trying to think of is trying to take these ideas about what we can do more seriously, to look at the hard figures for it, and then to try to take them seriously. Now, a big problem with using how many lives can we save as a metric is that there's this truism in public health that no one's ever saved a life because the person tends to die later, right? We don't, unless you were to become immortal, that would really be saving someone's life in that sense, and that'd be pretty good. Actually, I would recommend funding that if that was an option. But what you're more talking about is having someone, they still die. It's just they die at a different time. And it's not just at a different time, right? Because it means that you have more life, right? The distance between your birth and your death is longer, and you get more years of life in which to do things that are good for you. So that's the first issue, is that we can extend lives, and that's what we're really talking about. And so you might replace that with a question and say, how many life years can we save? And I think that's a much better question. But there's still this bit about what's the quality of that life. You might imagine a case where, say, you're in hospital and you've been diagnosed with a form of cancer, and you're given an option of a treatment for that cancer, which would mean that you will live longer, but that the quality of the life will be much lower. And maybe it's a very invasive chemotherapy. And it's not obvious that you should take that. I mean, if you had 10 years of life at low quality versus 9 years at higher quality, quite possibly 9 years would be better. So there's cases where you want to trade off between quality and quantity. And it would be foolish to just use the quantity here. And there's also cases where you want to compare non-life extending treatments. For example, if you cure someone of blindness, actually that does have a bit of an impact in how long they live. They live a bit longer if they're cured of blindness. But if we abstract that away, you can see there's also a lot of the benefit comes from turning normal years where you're blind into years where you're sighted. And that's a lot of the benefit. So you want to be able to capture both of those things. And the way that people in public health and health economics and the practical ethics tend to think about this is in terms of quality adjusted life years. So this takes into account both the quality and the quantity, and is also known as QALYS. So I'm going to use that term a bit. Quality adjusted life years, or QALYS. Now, to explain exactly what that is, I've got a slide here where this is a schematic of someone's life, at the health-related components of their life. And you can see here that it starts at 100% quality of life. I mean, it could start lower than that. It's just sketching something. And you can see that their life maybe it goes down in quality. They perhaps become sick during the early part, and then they recover, and then there's a sickness in middle age, which is also recovered from, and then various forms of stages of a gradual decline towards death at about 75 years old. And you could imagine a curve like this for someone. Maybe actually it would fluctuate a lot more. You know, you get up in the morning, you stub your toe while you're getting to the shower, and you drop, to 0 quality of life or something, or maybe negative, and then you bounce back up again, and various things. You can think about your overall quality of life. This is just meant to be your health-related quality of life. But you get the basic idea. It's a measure of how well you're doing. And maybe 100% is a bit arbitrary as well. Maybe you could get above that. But in terms of health-related quality of life, we tend to think 100% is someone who's perfectly healthy at that time. And 0 is someone who their health-related quality is equivalent to being dead. So maybe they'd be indifferent between being at that quality or being dead. Maybe being in a coma is a good example of 0, or maybe being in a level of pain which is so intense. Maybe those levels of pain so intense they're below 0, and there are some levels such that they're a bit above that, and they're at 0. So that's the basic idea. And then you can see that to apply it in practice, you could imagine a kind of stylized version of this question, where we have 2 lives here, which I think both live till 60 years at 70% quality. And here's 2 different ways you could improve that life, maybe 2 different health interventions. The first one improves the quality of that life, and then up to 90%. And the second one improves the length of the life, up to 70 years. And then what you do to compare which one is the greater benefit is you just look at the area of them. So it's just taking the integral, right, is the idea of that's the value of the life, or the area under the curve. And this, you'll be perhaps happy to know, is the standard approach used in public health. It's reasonably quantitative. And they allow us to compare apples and oranges within health, which is the real kind of key benefit of using this approach. It's important to say, though, that they're only a rough measure. So you might have been thinking, I understand how you'd measure this quantity of life, because you can measure when someone's born and you can measure which day they die. But I don't really understand how you could measure the quality of the life. It seems very hard. There are surveys which are designed to elicit responses to this. For example, you ask questions such as, if you could either live for 10 years in this health state, perhaps being blind, or you could live for 7 years in full health, which would you prefer? And then you start moving those numbers around, and you keep asking the question, and then you can use that to elicit a quality. That's called a time trade-off. There's other ways as well where you imagine there's a chance you'll die. You can either be perfectly healthy with a chance to die, or you can have this health state. How much chance to die would you be prepared to put up with to avoid that health state? So there are different ways like this, and they have slightly different methodologies and so on. And they elicit answers to these questions. But even then, they're probably still often going to be out by up to a factor of 2. You might think that's a pretty bad metric. If I had like a yard ruler, which was so inaccurate that it often got out by a factor of 2, you might think that was a very bad measure. But it turns out that in the universe of interventions that we're considering, a factor of 2 is enough to make quite a lot of progress. And I think it would often be less than a factor of 2. But I just wanted to flag that. It is an inherently rough measure. And what's in some ways is just surprising is that with such a rough measure, you can make so much progress. So the first question is what is a QALY worth? A quality adjusted life year. What's one of them worth? Well, here's something. In Britain, we have the National Health Service, and they're prepared to spend £20,000 for a quality adjusted life year. If a new drug comes on the market, which costs less than £20,000, so $30,000, they'll fund it for each life quality adjusted life year. If it costs more than £30,000 or $45,000, they won't fund it. If it's in between, they'll look at extra considerations. But they have an approach like this. Now there is 8,760 hours in a year. So this comes to about £2.30 per hour, or about $3.50 for an hour of healthy life. And I don't know what you think an hour of healthy life is worth for yourself, but for me, I would definitely think that this is a pretty good deal. If someone came into this room and was selling hours of healthy life and was reputable and trustworthy distributor of quality adjusted health hours, I would be using all the money that I have available to buy them and also get some more money from the bank and so forth. I think that's a pretty good deal. We often go to the cinema, for example, and spend much more than $3.50 to upgrade a normal perfectly healthy hour of our life into an hour where you're also at the cinema. And it seems this is a lot less good than creating entire new hours of your life in which you could do other activities and so on. And so I would think actually we should be willing to spend quite a lot more than that per hour of our life. So maybe the NHS should try to get more funding so that they can increase that limit. If actually all the individuals in society would be prepared to pay more out of their own pocket for it, then maybe the government should as well. But that's just a separate question. This is just trying to get an idea of what you think it's worth. Another question is, would you spend £20,000 to get a whole year? It's a bit harder because it's a very large lump of life. It's not just fine-grained. I think if you're prepared to spend £2.30 for an hour, then you should be probably prepared to spend £20,000 for a year. It's just like buying a lot of hours. But if maybe you don't have that amount of money in the bank, so it's hard to think in those terms. But here's another way to think about it. Would you prefer to have a salary of £20,000 per annum or a salary of £30,000 per annum but be blind? One of those for the rest of your life. Or you could bump those numbers up. You could say £120,000 versus £130,000 but be blind, or something like that. And for me, I would definitely think that this money is just not worth that much to me compared to my health, and I would definitely choose the ones on the left-hand side, unless it got really, really low. So I think that I would also be prepared to spend £20,000 for a year. So let's move on though. So that's what it's worth, right? It's worth at least that amount of money to us. Now, what does it cost? Which is a different question. Often things cost less than they're worth, which is why we buy them. If they cost more than they're worth, we should not buy them. Okay. So spending £20,000 on a QALY is a pretty good deal. Can we get one for less than that? Well, let's look at a question of preventing or curing HIV / AIDS. HIV being the virus, AIDS being the syndrome which you get if your viral load gets high enough and is a kind of late stage where you're immunocompromised. We all know it's a major cause of death and disability in developing countries. And there are many different approaches to dealing with it. And so let's look at a few of them in turn. So here's a comparison between two different health interventions. The first is treatment of Kaposi's sarcoma, which is a particular AIDS-defining illness. It's a skin condition, which you only get if you're really immunocompromised. So it's one of the ways that people decide whether to say that HIV has progressed to be AIDS. The second one is antiretroviral therapy, which is paying for drugs which fight the viral load and help prevent HIV turning into AIDS. As you can see, the second one is much more effective than the first one. This is just a longer bars are better type graph, and they're better in proportion to their length. And what we've measured it here is how many quality adjusted life years per £1,000, or per $1,500. And what I've drawn on there is a line which is the level it would need to be. It would need to be at least as long as that to be as effective as we thought the NHS use, which was just a yardstick that we had beforehand. And the NHS actually fund treatment of Kaposi's sarcoma, and it's funded in the US as well. It's considered to be kind of on the line, but to be effective enough in a rich world context. But you can see there's a very large discrepancy there in how much benefit you can produce for a given amount of donation. But it's even more interesting if we zoom out and then consider another intervention, prevention of transmission during pregnancy. So this is giving drugs to the mother, to the would-be mother during the stages of pregnancy so that the new child doesn't get HIV. And that's a very targeted intervention because you can target it at pregnant women who have HIV. And so that reduces the cost because you don't have to treat everyone else. And it avoids an entire lifetime of HIV, which is really good. And so the effectiveness of this is quite a lot more effective. I should say that these figures come from a report called Disease Control Priorities, second edition, which is a big aggregation of a whole lot of the cost effectiveness figures. There is a literature on this stuff where people try to estimate how cost effective these different things are. They do different types of trials, including randomized control trials. And some of it, they have less information, so they have to do more modeling, and it becomes a bit more tentative. But this is the estimate for this. But we can zoom out again and see more interventions. So we zoom out here. We can compare it to distribution of condoms. Is a lot more effective again, as it's very cheap to distribute them, and you can avoid a lot of cases of HIV. And you can only just, I was going to say you can only just see the this cost effectiveness threshold. Actually, we've moved it a little bit so that you can actually see it. It would just be invisible at this point. And these things are just extremely cost effective. And if we zoom out one more time, we can look at something, in this case it's not an AIDS related intervention, but distribution of bed nets to prevent malaria is even more cost effective again. And at this point, actually, if we hadn't slightly enlarged it, you wouldn't be able to see the bar for treatment of Kaposi's sarcoma. This new option is about 1,000 times more effective. So you can do 1,000 times more health gain for a given size of donation. And to look at the actual number, you can see it's nearing 60 years of healthy life for every $1,000, £1,000, which is very effective. So let's just pause for a moment and say, what can we learn from this? So one thing is that health programs in developing countries can be amazingly cost effective, about 1,000 times more so than we're willing to spend in our own countries on health, and about 1,000 times more effective than is needed to be a good deal, according to what we judged earlier when we said how much health do you need to get for £1,000 to be a good deal, and so on. And another thing is that our money is worth much more than we might have thought. Every £5 to £30, or what's that, $7.50 to $45, that's the kind of estimate range for that most effective one, is worth a year of healthy life. Worth is the wrong word, if I used this terms before, but it's enough to buy a year of healthy life. So that's quite interesting, because you might not have thought that you were carrying around enough money in your pocket today is like a whole year of healthy life for someone else. But you can only get these types of benefits with your money if it's used on the best programs, and also only if it's used on other people. So your money's worth a lot more than you might have thought if it's used for others. That's the catch. Otherwise, it would be great because I'd be telling you how to get 1,000 times more value for your money for yourselves, which would be a roaring success of a talk. But it's instead a talk as to how to get 1,000 times as much value for your money for other people, which is a bit less of a roaring success. But I hope it's still at least interesting. So these things I talked about are mainly focused on by policymakers, and this report was aimed at policymakers. People who are ministers of health in poor countries, and also people who run aid programs and so forth. But they're also of interest to all of us when it comes to charity and trying to work out how we can help people most with the money that we decide to give to charity. And maybe it will also make us think more about how much we should be giving once we realize it can be so effective. So when we try to donate money, we're trying to help people and to help them as much as we can. If we had some option, they said, we've got 2 programs and the second program helps people less. We wouldn't do that, right? It seems like we are trying to help people a lot. And so suppose we wanted to donate money to help fight AIDS. It really matters, actually, whether that money is used to fund treatment of Kaposi's sarcoma or to fund condom distribution, for example. There's a huge difference in effectiveness between these different options. And it's not actually enough to just know that the organization is trying to fight AIDS. You'd actually want to know more because some of the ways of doing that are a 100th as effective as other ways. And you might think that actually the organizations would be the experts on this and would know and would be doing the most effective one, but often they're not. One of the reasons for that is because they don't do as much program evaluation as we would like, because they're trying to keep their overheads ratio really good so that people will donate to them who have been kind of sucked in by the idea of the overhead ratio, which is a sad fact. But also, they just generally aren't aware of these figures. There's been not enough movement to really make people aware of these figures and to be aware of how good these things can be. Often if you talk to someone who's, say, funding a less effective treatment, they'll say that they're a very efficient organization because there's no way that they could fund that treatment more effectively than what they're doing. But that's a different question to, hang on, if we're really actually just trying to fight AIDS, maybe there are other ways to fight AIDS which would be more effective for those people. We don't have to always use the same intervention. And so it's relatively rare that people think of stepping to a different intervention. It's even rarer that they think of stepping to a different cause. Maybe they would think, what we're really trying to do is make people healthier and avoid, let's say, premature death or disability. In which case, maybe we should be focusing on malaria instead of AIDS and close down our AIDS arm and start up a malaria net distribution charity. I've never heard of any charity doing that, but there's a kind of mindset you get into, and if you're not familiar with these numbers, you think, well, this is where our expertise is and so on. We must be really good at doing this. But it turns out some of the things, even if you're an expert at them and 20% better at doing them than anyone else, that there's something else you could be doing that even if you were average at it would be 10 times more effective, 1,000% better. Which I think is really interesting. It's kind of the main point of this talk. So here's a few more summaries about, what does this all mean? I think one headline figure is that where to give can be even more important than whether to give. So suppose you had 3 options. One is that you don't donate anything. The second option is that you donate enough to save 100 quality-adjusted life years by funding HIV transmission prevention, which we saw was one of the middle level effectiveness. Or alternatively, you save 700 quality-adjusted life years by funding malaria net distribution. Well, interestingly, the difference in absolute terms between 2 and 3 is much bigger than the difference between 1 and 2. That's what I mean by saying where to give. That second question can be even more important than the first question about whether to give it all. Also, we can see that we can do pretty amazing things that we might not have thought of. So while you might have thought that you'd have to, in order to really help people, you'd have to go to another country, away from your friends and family, do a different career, not the thing that you're passionate about, and that you wouldn't be able to live the kind of affluent lifestyle that you're used to. But it's interesting to see that if you were to stay in your home country, do whatever job you wanted to do, with your friends and family, and donate 10% of your future income, which would still leave you very affluent by world standards, that you could save at least 3,000 quality-adjusted life years during your career, which is 3 millennia of life at perfect health, or 30 millennia of life, improving the health by 10% or some, equivalent. And I think that's pretty interesting, that these options are there for all of us if we want to take them. It's not just a radical choice with a huge amount of sacrifice. There are options with very little sacrifice, which would actually help a lot. So you can consider this question, how much good can we achieve if we really wanted to? I mean, I consider these options for me, spend the £1.5 million on myself, have my great kind of grad student plus life, or grad student plus plus in this case. It's the grad student plus life with also some extra, a better car or something and a bigger house and whatever. Or I could have, my grad student plus life, and also donate £1 million to others. And I chose to do the second thing because I had trouble actually after thinking about this, getting all that motivated about getting the extra plus there. It just wouldn't actually improve my life all that much. So I chose the second path, and I still have a great quality of life, and can save at least 30,000 QALYs, which is equivalent to saving 300 centuries of perfectly healthy life, which is pretty cool, right? It's a pretty exciting thing to be able to do, I think. So I wanted to stop for a moment because you might be thinking, how can this be right? These numbers must be wrong. How can people in our shoes do that much to help people? And I think that this helps to make it clear. And this graph is the world income distribution. And I think it's the most important chart in economics because it's the best kind of summary of the state of the world today. What we have here, it's slightly complicated. So what we have on the y-axis is income per household member. So that's a measure which, if you look at how big the household is, you look at the household income, you divide by the number of people in the household, so that children count on this as well. And a child in a poor family counts different to a child in a rich family. Whereas if you use a more naive measure, that doesn't work properly because it turns out that they've got no income because they don't work a job, and so it doesn't really come out right. But it's household income per member, and it's measured in US dollars adjusted for purchasing power parity. So PPP means that you take into account the fact that money goes further in poorer countries. For example, it goes about 4 times further in India than it does in Main Street, USA. So what they do is they effectively, multiply someone's actual income in India by 4 for this graph. If you didn't do that, this effect would be even more extreme. But they've taken that into account already. And then what we've done is we've lined everyone in the world up, all 7 billion people, from the poorest to the richest. And we'll look at how much income they have. And you can see that there's this extreme spike at the right-hand side. And if you're looking at this on a large projection screen, then on that screen, which is only itself about 1.5 yards tall, at that scale, you can see that there is an ellipsis there that I haven't been able to fit in the entirety of this curve. So this is something where if you had fit in this entire curve, it would be taller than Mount Everest at this scale. So it's a pretty extreme skewed distribution. I think it's a power law for people who are into that kind of stuff. What's particularly interesting about it is if you actually look at it, you might do what I did, which is to look at this and think, oh yeah, I'm somewhere in that bit where it curves around. I'm rich, but I'm not like the truly wealthy. Okay. And I won't be. There's these annoying people who earn this squillions of dollars per annum, and isn't that unfair? And I'm quite wealthy compared to these other people. But then if you actually look at these numbers, you realize that at the moment, particularly if you're a young person without children, or later on in your life when children leave home, you're going to be probably pretty wealthy on this, and probably a lot of the people watching this are in the richest 1% of the world's population, or will soon be in the richest 1% of the world's population. So they're in this area here. This is the richest 2% I've shaded. So what's kind of interesting is that actually we are in this spike typically. And then there's been a lot of interest recently about in America and Britain, other rich countries, about the 1% and the 99% on a national scale. But it's interesting that in the global scale, we are the 1%. And we often don't pay enough attention to that. But that's what's going on here. That's why the stuff that's in your pocket can buy years of healthy life, is because the stuff that's in your pocket is worth a crazy amount of money because we're all really rich. It's just that we tend to compare ourselves to our peers. And so we don't notice that as much. So I'll just talk a little bit before questions about the organization that I've set up, which tries to take these ideas and put them into practice. And it's called Giving What We Can. So it's a community of people who feel strongly about improving the lives of those people in developing countries. It's a group where each member of the group has made a pledge to donate at least 10% of their income to wherever it is that they think can do the most to help people in poor countries. And we also run a website that collects and shares information on the most cost-effective charities to help our members and to also help the general public. So even if one thinks 10%, maybe that's a bit much for me, but I'd really love to find out more about this. How do I do more effective giving? Which charities are they that actually implement some of these most effective interventions and that we've done extra due diligence on and so forth? Well, you can go to our website and check that out. If you just search for Giving What We Can, you'll find it. It's givingwhatwecan.org. And there's two aims that we have in this organization, and they fit in with what I've been talking about in this talk. So the first aim is getting people to give more. So this square represents something like what people were giving previously, on average in the US. And firstly, I want to try to convince people that they could give a lot more than they do. It's actually not that much of a sacrifice because most of the things that are really important in our lives are actually very cheap. People say this all the time. Turns out they're right. It's true. And you can get a lot of the value of your life on not much of the money of it. But so getting people to give 10% in this case. And the second aim is getting people to give to more effective organizations, which works out something like this. And so together, we massively increase the total impact. And it's very plausible that anyone who's hearing this talk could actually improve the impact they're going to have through charitable donations over their life by a factor of 100. Quite possibly by more than that, actually. But because you've got these two different dimensions, and it's not additive, it's multiplicative, it leads to a really big benefit if you're doing both of these things right. We have 292 members, I think, or maybe slightly more now, who've pledged to donate at least 10% of their income. This comes to more than $100 million of income that's pledged over their lives, which was enough to fund between 2 and 11 million quality-adjusted life years. To put that into some kind of context, 5 million years is the period of time since humans and chimpanzees diverged evolutionarily. Or 200,000 years is the amount of time Homo sapiens has been around. So this is quite a large amount of life. And we've got local chapters to try to discuss these ideas and get people interested in various places, including Oxford, Cambridge, London, Princeton, Harvard, Rutgers, San Diego, Canberra. Some of them are universities, some of them are towns. And we try to get people involved in talking about these ideas. Yeah, that's the web address. So just to conclude, we're exceptionally wealthy living in rich countries in comparison to people in the poor countries. And our money can do hundreds of times more for them than it can for us. In fact, I gave a pretty good argument, I think, they could do 1,000 times as much good. Because we think that if we spent the money on some of these health interventions just at that where I had that barrier, that would be better than how we spend our own money. And then we realized that would produce an amount of health which is 1,000th as much as we could produce for other people. So it's a pretty good argument that therefore we can do at least 1,000 times as much to help other people. But maybe you think some of these numbers are a bit uncertain, and let's be safe and say just 100 times as much good. However, it can only achieve this if it's given wisely. So we really want to spend a lot of time thinking about where to give, or at least just spend a very small amount of time checking a website of people who do spend a large amount of time spending probably more than hundreds of hours, maybe thousands of hours now, thinking about where that is and looking at the research on this and trying to work out the best approaches. This idea that where to give is even more important than whether to give. And finally, the world is an unfair place with a great deal of suffering, as I'm sure you all knew before you came into the room. But we can each do a tremendous amount to help make it better. And let's do so. Thank you. So now, I believe if people have had some questions, then I'm going to get a laptop up here with some moderated questions. Okay. Yeah, so if you're just tuning in now, and you're in Google, that's geo/Ord, O-R-D, my surname, hyphen Dory, D-O-R-Y. But for now, let's take this question here.
Yeah, your example of blindness in particular got me thinking about all these cognitive biases that people have and how they routinely overestimate what they think is going to be the impact of especially disabilities on their life, and how, in reality that we're much more on a hedonic treadmill and we adapt really quickly after, even losing a limb or becoming blind or something like that. How do you think we should adjust these QALY figures for that sort of cognitive bias?
Yeah, it's a great question. Actually, people in public health, including here at Harvard, are looking at these types of questions. And it turns out if you elicit these quality weightings by a group of healthy people, let's say in the case of blindness, they say that blindness is about a year of blindness is at about half quality. It's like they'd be indifferent between 2 years of blind life versus 1 year of perfectly healthy life. And however, if you ask people who have been blind, particularly not just in the first 6 months or so, the first 6 months or so probably is really bad, adjusting to that. After that, they tend to say it's less bad than that. Although interestingly, it turns out that if they then regain sight, they then say it was actually worse than they were saying when they were blind. So there's an extra effect to that cognitive biases thing, that there is this extra aspect where it partly depends on the state they're in. And I think we often like to think the state we're in is particularly good compared to other states, so we can feel happy about our lives. But it's difficult to know exactly how to take that into account because it seems to keep fluctuating. But I would think that maybe just taking the average of a group of sighted people and a group of blind people would at least be a good first step on that. If you did that, then maybe it would say that instead of being half as good and having a quality weight of 0.5, the quality weight should actually be 0.6 or 0.7 or something. That won't change the numbers that I'm using very much, though. But it is the type of thing that if we could get more fine-grained than this and try to work out some more nitty-gritty questions, that it'd be really useful to. I mean, an improvement of the accuracy of an estimate by 20% is certainly worth having. So it's a good question. Do we have any other questions?
Question from Mountain View.
Okay.
So I have two questions to this. One is, could you address the next hurdle that people have to giving? So the first hurdle is, will it make a difference? And this talk addresses that. The next question is this the difference that I want to make? So let's say that it turned out let's pretend that the most effective way was to give food to people who are starving in some location. And we could feed them, and let's say this was the cheapest thing that could be done, and it would give the most quality of life, quality-adjusted life years. But then the thing is that some people might feel that doing this just means that there's going to be extra millions of people who are going to starve the next year. So many people won't give because this may be the most effective way is to prevent people from dying by giving them mosquito nets and so on, but it's just a bigger problem for another day. So that's my first question. The second question is, if we really take this argument all the way to its extreme, one might say that, let's just say the U.S. government within the U.S. borders, then we don't have to deal with the issue of helping people in other countries. But everything that's done could be, in some sense put on this utilitarian scale. If I build a new bridge, we could talk about how that helps people in ways, I mean, it's not a good example, but there are other kinds of things like this where you could say that, well, there's other things that we do that improve people's lives. If we just determine that there are two things, let's say, that are the most effective at improving people's lives, why doesn't government do only those two things and stop doing almost anything else that's not necessary, right? So, cut all the welfare programs, cut everything else, cut anything, for special needs children or whatever, because this is the one, these two programs that we've determined are the only ones that are, going to give us the most effective results. So, could you address those two concerns?
Yeah, wow, they're both big questions. So I'll take the second one first. So if you look at these things, so one thing to say is the government in the US actually does do this, but they use a different methodology. This is the one I'm talking about is called cost effectiveness analysis. The one the US government uses is called benefit cost analysis or cost benefit analysis. And that's an approach where you measure the benefits in terms of dollars and you measure the cost in terms of dollars. So they actually do use this in order to work out, they try to kind of pull together benefits based on how much people would be willing to pay in order to get those benefits. Oh, sorry. So they do think about this in the US and measure things like this. Although that methodology, I think, has quite a lot more flaws in it. It's got a lot of more room for ethical problems to arise than the one I'm talking about. But anyway, the thing is that if you really did want to help people as much as possible, then going with a sophisticated version of this approach is the way to do that. It's just defined to be the way that helps people as much as possible. And so therefore, I think that's is a pretty good idea to go with. As in your particular case, it'll turn out that if there are just a couple of interventions, that they will end up with diminishing marginal returns. So what we've tried to get here is estimates as to how effective it is on the margin. So if you're going to save one more life from malaria, with the current amount of malaria mosquito net distribution, how much would that cost? But if you roll that out to, say, 80% of the population, and then you're trying to get the last 20% covered, then that can be much more costly. So sometimes there are issues where that will change. And so what you want to think of is for each of these interventions, you want to think of its cost curve, would be the more sophisticated way to do it. But also, even then, you'll saturate these things. So for example, mosquito net distribution, there are the number of people dying from malaria per year is uncertain. It's somewhere between about 700,000 per annum and 2 million per annum. Let's say it's 1.5 million per annum. And the amount it costs to save a life due to malaria, on average, by distributing nets, is about $2,300. So now I've set up a multiplication problem for me. But there's something around about $3 billion worth of money that would be needed to totally cover that, which is actually very small compared to, say, the US budget. So with some cases like this that are very effective, it turns out that you can actually completely saturate them, and it won't be the case that there's just two things that end up getting done. The really effective things will get done, and then they'll get to move on to the next most effective and the next most effective, and they'll get quite far down the list. So it is actually pretty valuable. In fact, in terms of these interventions, I've got a nice chart which I didn't present, but if you look at all of the interventions that the DCP2 looked at, and you do a chart of all of them, you can find that that they're log normally distributed, and that the most effective 20%, if you were to fund them all equally, 80% of the benefits would come from the most effective 20%. So if you do work your way down from the top, you actually cover a huge amount of benefit. So also the first question was about additional issues. I definitely think that QALYS and cost effectiveness analysis at this kind of level is not the be all and end all about this. I'm trying to just get these ideas onto the table in terms of how you can think about this with a kind of simple examples. And obviously you could have more and more hours of making them more sophisticated and trying to get better data and so on. But in the particular case of overpopulation, that's another thing that you'd want to think about as to the effects of that. You'd ideally want to take that into account. Now I can say that it turns out that there's a couple of big points you can make there. One of them is that it turns out that saving infant lives probably actually helps with overpopulation. It actually reduces the expected number of people on the planet because it turns out that if there's a process called the demographic transition where once people get wealthier and their children start surviving better, they have fewer children. And it's more than proportional, so it compensates. And this is what has happened in rich countries, and it seems to be happening in some of the poor countries. So it looks like if you get actually child survival to be improved, it actually would fight overpopulation rather than exacerbate it. The other thing I could say is even if you didn't believe that, you could try to find some organizations, and we recommend a couple on our website, which don't save lives but just improve quality of life. And so that would be a way to do it that would have where that other argument wouldn't come up. And then a third thing to say is that if you really thought that that overpopulation was so bad that you're willing to just let a whole lot of people die in order to because the overpopulation, the badness of the overpopulation of helping was going to be bigger than the goodness of helping those people, then you must think that overpopulation is really, really bad. It's so bad that that even if we could spend £15 to save a year of life, that the overpopulation effect is even bigger. In which case, you should just donate money to fight overpopulation. That would be the logical conclusion. The conclusion wouldn't be there's this absolutely terrible thing that's so horrific that it overwhelms these amazingly big benefits, therefore I won't do anything. But therefore I'll donate money to a group that say distributes condoms or educates people about family planning and so on. And there's plenty of those groups as well. So I think that style of response ends up not quite blocking the course of this argument, I think. So I hope I've answered your questions there.
Yeah, thank you. I think that in the same way that a year of life extended can be adjusted to be a quality adjusted year of life extended, I'd like to see this analysis. I'd be really, really happy to see if this analysis could be further extended. One more thing about whether it is also generating or getting rid of a problem. In other words, one more adjustment that would be more convincing to people, I think, then that, yes, if I donate to this, I'm not only giving extra quality adjusted life years, but I'm also diminishing and not increasing the problem for tomorrow.
Yeah. No, I agree. There's definitely potential additional considerations, and we want to take them into account. I'm totally on board with that.
Thank you.
So here are a couple of questions that have come in. One of them is, you showed how giving effectively is much, much better than giving ineffectively. Have you considered the other ways of giving, volunteering, personal relationships, etc.? Work was the other one. Maybe they can be even more effective for some of us than giving money. Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's plausible. I think personal relationships is one that occurs to a lot of people when they're thinking about this. Is like, how can I be a good person in terms of my family and friends? But it seems that once you get to these scales, it's hard to see that really the best things that you can achieve, or overall, in some kind of neutral, impartial sense, are going to be through that. But the other areas of volunteering is potentially very valuable, as is work, depending on what you do. So, for example, it could be the case that I have in my spare time set up this organization, which has done a lot of good, and so probably I've done more good through my volunteering than I will achieve actually through all of my donations over my life, which is pretty cool. And similarly, if you can find some really high impact volunteering approaches, then you could do a lot of good. It is definitely hard through volunteering for things in rich countries to have as much impact as we've seen. Often, in fact, one could have even more impact if one worked a few extra hours and then donated the money. That might seem surprising, but if you remember that some economics, that we have a comparative advantage in some kind of field, and that's the field where we get the most money. And so if we go into that field and earn money, and then it's very effective, because then we can pay someone who does the thing that we're interested in. So we get, for example, an expert in computing to, instead of donating their computing services to a poor person, to use that to get money to pay the person that the poor person needs, and to pay someone who's actually an expert in those things, as opposed to someone who's more of a dilettante. But it does depend. But volunteering could potentially be even more important if you get really high leverage on it, and work could be really important as well. It's hard to know in terms of improving technology. Obviously, there's been a lot of technology spillovers for poor countries, which have been very useful. For example, allowing them to leapfrog landlines and to go straight into mobile phones in order to get connected. I think a lot of people would have thought that would take a lot longer before that would be useful. So there are potentially a lot of approaches there. And also maybe doing your job has various other effects. So obviously, it depends on what it is. But I don't know exactly how to assess these things. They're quite a lot harder to assess. So I'm not claiming that they're less valuable, really, so much as there's at least quite a high bar to beat. But maybe they could be even more valuable than that. And I think that people should think about those things quite seriously. Another question is the following. It seems that core to the high QALY cost effectiveness is the fact that the donated dollars are used in developing countries. What are the implications for those who want to give locally, for example, in developed countries? That's a good question. So there are various implications. So one implication is that you might think within your local area, whether that's your country or your community, that you also want to take these ideas in light and to try to give effectively within those areas. I don't have particularly good data on that, but you probably want to start thinking about it a bit, because once you see that there are several orders of magnitude separating the best and worst interventions in poor country settings, you might think that there actually could be quite a lot of discrepancy between the interventions in rich country settings. And in fact, there are, in terms of health at least. There's a similar kind of curve for health interventions in rich countries. So that's something where maybe also on other forms of volunteering or donation that you could get that happening, and you'd start to see this lesson that choosing where to give, it could be worth maybe let's say spending half the time you'd spend earning to donate the money just doing research on this problem, and then donating half the money to something that's more than twice as effective. That's quite plausible. So at least to spend, say, 10% of the time or whatever on the question about where. Another question, though, I think would be to really think about why it is that you want to help locally instead of globally. I've had a nice advantage on this, which is that I was born in Australia, and so my local thing would have been to help Australians. And I wouldn't care about helping British people over say, Kenyan people, because I didn't know any British people or Kenyan people and so on. And it seemed fairly obvious that if I could help more people in Kenya than I could in Britain, that would be the better thing to do. Otherwise, I'd be kind of unduly privileging British people for some reason. Now that I've moved to Britain, I still kind of am in this situation, and I also kind of feel, why would I help Australians rather than helping more people somewhere else, or helping them in better ways? So it's helped to kind of break some of that partiality for me in terms of this type of donation. Obviously, I'm still very partial in my personal relationships, but I think that I can kind of help the world more in these ways. And so one would also want to think that it's often very difficult to help in such extreme ways, and to spend some time thinking about the ratios that you would end up with. Is it the case that that for the most effective way you can help people locally, you could help 100 times as many people globally? If so, then you might think, can I really justify a 100 to 1 ratio in terms of that? Maybe I would, if I had a chocolate cake, I would give it to my friend rather than to a stranger. Other things being equal or something. But if there was a case that I had to stop 100 strangers having their chocolate cakes in order to give one to my friend, maybe I wouldn't do that. So it could be interesting thinking quantitatively about some of those things as well. But there's a lot of people who think that that it could be that they're not swayed by these reasons and so on. If so, that's fine. I'm just trying to give some arguments. It's only 2 minutes left. Is there time for another question? There is one. Anyone locally or globally?
Here's a quick question.
Thanks.
It's actually locally.
Oh, sorry.
What is your opinion of GiveWell's recommendations? Why don't you just outsource all of your recommendations to them, because they seem to be looking for very similar things?
Yeah, great. So for those people who aren't aware, GiveWell is a charity evaluator, formerly operating from New York, I think now from San Francisco. And they are assessing, doing this kind of thing, trying to look at different charities and where you can kind of help people the most for your donations. And I think that they're great and have done good research on this. When they started up, they managed to launch a couple of years before Given What We Can, as I had to finish my PhD. But we kind of were thinking about these things in a similar time, and we're in contact with each other. And we're both really frustrated by the fact that there's a lot of really good research being done that's not been shared with the public. So foundations, say the Gates Foundation, I'm sure they do a lot of really fantastic research on where to give, and then they use up those opportunities as well, and they don't kind of share this information more broadly. And I think it was great to share it, and that was GiveWell's approach to share that really publicly. I think that's their real big advantage. So we at Given What We Can take their advice very seriously. It's one of the several inputs that we take. We also talk to people at the World Health Organization, the World Bank, Oxfam, lots of places, and try to find out what's going on and what we think about different interventions. And sometimes we come up with different conclusions to GiveWell, but they're probably, of all of those kind of inputs to our decision-making process, they're probably the largest. And so we take them very seriously. So definitely, do a search for GiveWell as well, and have a look at what they say. Thank you.